Hello and good afternoon to everyone, and just want to welcome everyone to our next installment of our summer series, which is going to be centered on food safety in schools. So if you have not had the opportunity to use the chat right now, just go ahead and drop in the chat and say hello and let us know where you are checking in from and what organization you are representing. That would be wonderful. And while folks are doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and just talk about 3 quick objectives that we're going to cover today. The first thing you're going to hear us talk about a lot is our food safety plan. And typically for schools, the food safety plan is the HACCP plan. So we're going to identify key points of HACCP to improve food safety plans. Also, we're going to have a very brief discussion on food safety pathogens and how to control them. And last but not least, we will share some food defense best practices. So, as I said today, we will be talking about a food safety plan, and each school must have a food safety plan. And when we think of the food safety plan for our school, the food safety plan should be customized to meet the unique production and service systems in each school. So that means if you have one set of schools that might have one particular vendor and another school have another method of service, maybe self-prep or another vendor, their safety plan should not look the same as another site. And the plan has to be updated based on the school nutrition program. So again, if something changes, you want to make sure that your safety plan changes. They should also be easily accessed and must be made available during administrative review or during a health inspection. We can't stress the importance enough of staff knowing how to find the plan. Managers must understand the plan and ensure that it is implemented. This is in the event that the manager did not create the plan. Sometimes we will see folks take a template and just adapt it for their school, but we also want to make sure that managers understand the plan as being adapted. And last but not least, we want to ensure that schools know that the food safety plan is a living document that must be followed and updated as operations change. So a couple of questions. I will just have you can either come off mute or you can drop it in the chat. But a couple of questions before we dive into the content matter. Does your organization have a customized food safety plan? Is it easily accessible, or when was the last time it was updated? So I'll give a few seconds in case anyone wants to come off of chat, come off of mute. Again, if you'd like, just feel free to answer these questions in the chat. What do you think of when you hear food safety plan? Do you know that your organization has one? We'd love to hear from you. All right, so while we just wait for some responses in the chat, we're just going to go ahead and dig into the content for your food safety plan. So as mentioned earlier, your food safety plan should be should contain some of the principles of HACCP. And HACCP is a wonderful word, and sometimes we don't know what it stands for. So HACCP, the definition of HACCP is a systematic approach to construct a food safety program designed to reduce the risk of foodborne hazards by focusing on each step of the food preparation process. And that process starts from the moment that the food is received until the moment that it goes on to a plate for consumption. And why do we need a food safety plan? And why do we need to have a food safety plan that incorporates the principles of HACCP? Well, the goal of the food safety plan, again, is to prevent foodborne illnesses and serve safe foods to our students. Also, sorry, let me just, okay. With HACCP, you can do the following things. First and foremost, you can identify foods and procedures most likely to cause foodborne illnesses. For this particular purpose, we're going to use a hamburger as an example. So one of the foodborne pathogens that can be found in a hamburger patty if it's E. coli. HACCP can also allow us to develop procedures to reduce the risk of an outbreak. So using the same hamburger patty, cooking it to 155 degrees Fahrenheit can kill E. coli. HACCP also allows us to monitor the procedures to keep food safe. An example of how we can do that is to make sure that once the patty is cooked, we hold it above 140 degrees Fahrenheit to minimize bacterial growth. And lastly, we can use HACCP to verify that the food served has been handled properly at each step. Again, an example of this is making sure that we document the food cooking and the holding temperature for the hamburger patty at each step. So let's break it down. What does HACCP stand for? Well, HACCP is an acronym for the following terms, and we'll look at what each of those terms means individually. So the H and the A stands for hazard analysis. And this principle is a review of your food service operation to find areas where food safety problems can occur. So with this step, you're not necessarily handling the food, but you are looking at the potential places where there could be a safety issue. The next is control measures. And these are the steps that you can take to identify, to reduce the likelihood of food contamination. So now that you've done the step of analyzing where they could become safe, you put control measures in place to make sure that you reduce the likelihood of them becoming unsafe. Next, we have critical control points. And critical control points in food preparation and processing, where controlling a step such as cooking is essential to assure food safety, is important. So again, now that you've identified where food can become unsafe, you can identify the control points in order to make sure that the food is safe. With HACCP, you also identify critical limits. This is the time and temperature ranges for food preparation and service, either hot or cold, that can keep food safe. This one is really important in schools food service because this speaks to, for example, a field trip. So the temperature that we hold food as we take them on the bus, transport them to the site where the schools are going to be visiting, and then making sure that they're at a safe temperature for consumption. This is where critical limits are important. Also, use the process approach, which is a method of grouping menu items into one of three processes depending on the number of times the food goes through the temperature danger zone. And just as a reminder, the food danger zone is between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. So the first step to managing your food safety plan is to ensure that your employees are trained. Typically, this can be done during the course of the beginning of the school year during professional development days, but that should not be the extent to when staff is trained. Staff would be best served to be trained quarterly or maybe even biannually. Also, you want to make sure that you have SOPs for specific occurrences. So, for example, using the hamburger patty, if that hamburger was to reach an unsafe temperature, what is the procedure for making that food safe? Are you going to throw it out? Are you going to reheat it and get it to the proper holding temperature? What is the specific protocol for a hamburger? And the hamburger protocol may not be the same as how you would handle milk or produce. You also want to make sure that you have the proper tools for monitoring those critical control points that we talked about. This includes not just having a thermometer to be able to check the temperature of food, it also includes having the proper equipment that is working and able to maintain the temperatures desired for each food item. You also want to be able to provide an environment where concerns can be voiced and addressed. Staff should not feel like they cannot share concerns and have a fear of reprimand or not being taken seriously. While no one wants to have a concern come up because we know that's just added work, when we think of our community and the students that we serve, any concerns should be addressed and staff should be comfortable doing so. In addition, to identifying concerns, you also want to make sure that you have a tracking log so that you're able to identify incidents, how they were handled, and any changes that may have been made to your food safety plan as a result of the incident. And then last but not least, as mentioned earlier, as your food service procedures change, so should your food safety plan. If you change vendors, if you change your method of service, maybe from eating in the cafeteria to eating in the classroom, these are things that could potentially change how you're handling the food that you're serving to students. Okay. So our next slide really does bring to light the fact that the potential does exist for foodborne illnesses to occur in schools. And while we'd like to think that all the food that we serve is safe, we do have information based on a 2017 study from the CDC. And it shows that school-associated outbreaks accounted for 1% of all reported outbreaks to the CDC. And in 2017, there were 8 reported school outbreaks and 489 restaurant outbreaks. And while the average number of illness per outbreaks in schools is higher, although they only account for 1% of the outbreaks, we can see that the illnesses per outbreak is higher in schools than they are in restaurants. And so this is actually another quite scary uh, visual to have to look at, because this actually looks at the different pathogens that occur in schools. And while it's going to be a little bit challenging to read it now, we will certainly send this information out with the slides after this session. But the thing that we want to draw your attention to are the 2 that you're seeing the most prevalent. And the most prevalent pathogens occur from the norovirus, which you can see that is pretty much that color in red. You're seeing a lot of that occur. And then the next one that you see is Salmonella. And we know from just how we handle norovirus in schools, we know that when there is vomiting in the schools, that there should be procedures in place for how that's being handled. And Salmonella can be minimized by proper cooking and holding temperatures. So what are the top 5 risk factors that can cause food to become unsafe in schools? The first one is improper temperature control, and that can include things such as improper hot and cold holding, which means not holding food at their right temperatures. It can also include improper cooling techniques. So for instance, if a school is going to serve a batch of chili and they've made it the night before, how that chili is taken down to temperature prior to being put in the refrigerator for the night can affect how pathogens and bacteria may grow. Also, using the same chili, if we did have pathogens and bacteria grow in that chili, if we had improper reheating techniques, that could increase the risk of foodborne illness. The second one is inadequate cooking. So when we talk about inadequate cooking, we're talking about the insufficient time or temperature control used during the cooking and heating process. It is important for schools to recognize that each food item and each food group has specific temperatures that it must reach during the cooking process to ensure that it is safe. And once that food reaches that temperature, it is important that that food is held at the proper temperature to ensure that, again, the food is safe for consumption. The next one is cross-contamination. Cross-contamination can occur when contaminated raw product comes in contact with food that is going to be either consumed raw or may even have cross-contamination of the ingredients in a specific item. One example is a salad. So you may have chicken that has been cooked and it may be at the right temperature, but if you have lettuce that has been contaminated, once you have the lettuce, which is not going to undergo any type of cooking procedure, that can contaminate all of the other items in the salad. And last but not least, also foods can become contaminated if the environment in which the food is stored is not safe. So as we've been taught through the pandemic, we know that proper sanitation is key to prevent the spread of not only the coronavirus, but it can also be helpful in preventing cross-contamination. Another thing that we see in food risk safety is the hygiene of employees. So that can come from a lot of different things. The first thing is that if a food handler comes to work sick, and we think that they may be infectious, they have the potential to contaminate a food service for the day. So if an employee is identified as not feeling well, they should not be allowed into the premises, or they should be partaking in practices that do not entail handling food. Also, it is important to make sure that staff has clean uniforms. So if a staff member has the same uniform that they have not cleaned properly, may have items on there from the day before, that can actually contribute to unsafe food in schools. The last thing I would mention is bare hand contact with food. While there are some foods that are allowed to be handled with bare contacts, for the purpose with bare hands, for the purpose of school food safety, all items should be handled with the food handler wearing gloves. And then the last place for us to talk about where food can become unsafe is to simply receive food from unsafe sources. So it is very important that we identify who is providing our food and understand some of the safety practices that they have in place to ensure that you receive safe food from the start. So now that we've talked about some things where food can become unsafe, how do we create a food safety culture? As mentioned before, it all starts with training. Again, this can be done during the course of the school year just to kind of set the pace. I'm sorry, at the beginning of the school year, to set the pace and the understanding of how important food safety is and the measures that staff can take to ensure that the food is safe. Once we have trained our staff, it's important that we conduct periodic performance reviews and ensure that these measures are being taken. So again, this can be done monthly, quarterly, or annually, but a periodic review of how food is being handled and the measures that we're taking to keep it safe should definitely come into play at least once per year. Once you perform your periodic reviews, concerns should be shared and identified, and changes that may need to be made need to be implemented. Staff need to know if a problem has occurred and if the plan has changed. In addition to changing the plan, updated practices of food service methods may change. Again, if you change where you're providing meals or what vendors providing meals, you want to make sure that your food safety plan changes. And last but not least, don't go it alone. We think it's best if you not only not share this with your employees, but you also want to make sure that you're sharing it with the broader school community. This includes teachers, administrators, and the school nurse. So again, as we talk about potentially serving meals in the classroom, we want to make sure that teachers identify how they play a role in ensuring that food served to students is safe. So the next thing that we'll talk about is food defense. And food defense is the protection of food from intentional contamination. So while we know that food can become unsafe by pathogens and bacteria, sometimes food can become unsafe because there may be a literal intention to harm the food that's going to be served to our students. And so food defense involves putting security measures in place that reduce the chances of someone in the operation intentionally contaminating the food supply. And so when we talk about that, what is going to be your defense for making sure that your food is kept safe? And while we don't want to think about it, the potential does exist for us to have a disgruntled employee or a vendor that may not be pleased with us that may want to harm our food. So the first step is to develop your food defense plan. The food defense plan should be written or documented to identify mitigation strategies and protective measures that will be implemented within the facility. Vulnerability assessments help to inform where mitigation strategies are needed. Simply put, going back to with your HACCP plan, that hazard analysis, this would be your hazard analysis for your food defense. Where are potential places for your food to be contaminated intentionally? The second step is to implement the mitigation strategies and protective measures. So mitigation strategies and preventive measures to better protect facilities, personnel, and operations should be put into place once you identify potential weaknesses and opportunities for food to be contaminated. The next step is to test the mitigation strategies and the protective measures. The food defense plan should be tested annually. And testing your plan can be as simple as verifying that food defense practices that you have in place, such as locks on equipment and cameras, are functional. So again, if you were to come into your facility, are your refrigerators locked? Are your cameras working to show potential intentional contamination of the food? If these items are not in place, then you should make sure that you have them in place so that your food cannot become unsafe intentionally. And last but not least, you want to review and maintain a food defense plan that is current and it is functional. Again, as things may change, you may need to change your food defense plan. Again, we don't want to think about the potential for someone harming our food, but it does happen. All right, so again, while we don't want to think about it, why do we need a food defense plan? Again, you may have a disgruntled food service employee, you may have vendors or suppliers that seek to do you harm. And also, believe it or not, sometimes disgruntled members of the school food community themselves can seek to do harm to our students or just our plan to keep food safe. So again, not saying that we have this happen often, but the potential does exist that we could have to protect our food from intentional contamination. So what can we do? We can create a the food defense plan, and that begins where identifying where and how food is stored. Again, is it in the refrigerator? Is it in a dry storage area? Once we identify where and how it's stored, we should also identify who has access to the food. So, is it only that our food service staff employees have access? Is it potential that some of our administrative staff have access to the food in the event of an emergency? They should also be made aware of the food defense plan. And you should also identify what security measures are needed. Again, do you need to have locks on things? Do you need to have cameras to identify that? I know this may sound extreme, but it is something that we've certainly seen that, we just want to make sure that we're monitoring our facilities and ensuring that food is not becoming unsafe. You also want to share the plan with employees and your principal or your executive director. So again, this isn't something that you should go alone. Ensuring that your school food community recognizes the potential for food to become unsafe should not be something that you keep to yourself. This is a community effort. This is a group effort. And the more eyes that we have to ensure that our food is safe, the better off our students will be. And as mentioned earlier, you should review the plan periodically to see if updates are needed. And if there are any concerns, again, share this with your school food community. If a breach of the security for keeping food safe has occurred, you want to make sure that all folks are aware and how they can make sure that they do their part to ensure that school food is safe for students to consume. And so while this is just a really brief overview of some steps that you can take to ensure that your school food is safe, we do have a plethora of resources available for you here. As Nigel mentioned, they are available and these links are live, so you can literally click on them. I personally geek out on this stuff. I could just literally click on all these links. There's so many different things that are listed in these particular on these particular websites. the Iowa State HACCP plan. I wanted to highlight that because, as many of you know, each year we do review your NSLP applications. And so with that comes a review of your HACCP plans. And again, while this is a template, this is something that should be identified and specified for your specific school food service and your specific site. In addition to that, there's some guidance from the USDA. There's also a HACCP case study for a high school. So if you're interested in seeing how HACCP can really be important when implemented in school systems, that would be a great resource for you. Again, there is some information from Iowa State and the Center for Food Safety and Child Nutrition Programs. That is a really wonderful organization that their job, as you can see, is to look for opportunities for food safety in all child nutrition programs across the board. And then last but not least, we just finished talking about food defense. And so the USDA does have resources to help you identify how you can keep your food safe, not only from pathogens and bacteria, but also from intentional contamination. All right, so again, that was a very, very brief touch on food safety in schools. Again, we can go so deep into HACCP plans and food safety plans, and we will just stop here because we can talk about this all day. But I did want to open it up for any questions that folks may have as it relates to how they can keep their food safe, or any questions or challenges that they might be experiencing as it pertains to food safety in their school.
While we're waiting for questions to come in, I just want to briefly jump in and say I'm about to drop a link to a brief evaluation form in the chat. If you all could complete that for us, it goes a long way in helping us continuously improve the training that we provide to you all. And it gives you an opportunity to tell us what type of topics you want to get additional training on. So I'm going to drop that link now, and feel free to submit your questions in the chat or come off mute and ask any questions that you may have about food safety.
So while we are waiting for folks to share any questions with us, I also just wanted to, again, take a moment to say thank you to everyone for joining us. And I did see one comment, let's see, from Melissa. She said she is new and still learning. One thing that I will say, Melissa, is yes, we are all still learning. So the resource that I mentioned in the Center for Food Safety in Schools, I actually attended a seminar, a week-long conference for them actually, and I learned a lot about that as well. I learned a lot about food safety in that as well. So I think what's important is that we have access to resources that are able to help us when we have questions. And I also think it's important for us to think about that prior to us serving food so that we are able to be able to react in the event that we do have a food safety concern. We have a set of practices and procedures that we're easily able to implement and utilize any standard operating procedures if we do have an incident arise. So we are all still learning. All right, well, I will take it. The fact that we have not received any questions or comments, that we are all now food safety experts. We understand the importance of having a food safety plan. We also understand the importance of having a HACCP plan or a food safety plan that certainly has principles of HACCP so that we can identify how and when food become unsafe, and how we can make sure that they're not either those concerns are mitigated or we do not serve the food to students. Additionally, we also have an idea of how we can proactively create food defense programs so that food does not become intentionally contaminated. So if there aren't any questions, I would just like to wrap up and share with you all again. Each school is responsible for having a food safety manager on premises. And there are many different resources for schools to obtain that training for the person that they identify as the food safety manager, in addition to training available for the employees to obtain food safety handling training as well. So want to just make sure that that is something that schools are aware of. There's a lot of opportunity for food safety training. In addition to this video being saved on our website, you can certainly visit the Department of Health, the DOH for the district, and get other implementation strategies and ideas for obtaining training for your staff as well. So with that, I will say thank you. I don't know if there are any other housekeeping notes, Nigel. I will turn it over to you. But I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending. And I pretty much am the point person for food safety in the division. So if you have any questions, by all means, again, my name is Lizette Wells. I'm happy to answer any questions that may arise prior to the school year, during the course of the school year, so that we can make sure that we serve safe food to our students.